All right, let's dig in a little bit more deeply into some of these points. Words really matter. I grew up loving speaking. I want you to think about maybe your very, very first early passion. Maybe you're the kid that put all the Legos in a row, or maybe you were the kid, my son Ben's so competitive, he'd wake up and want to know who woke up first. Like sleeping was a race. You know, like you have these things the way you're wired. For me, it was speaking. I grew up in the Bible Belt, and I'd put all of my stuffed animals, and I'd give a sermon, and we'd have an altar call, and I'd tell a story, and I'd mobilize people to action, and I'd have a phrase or two that I'd repeat. And, it wasn't about dolls or nurses. It was about sharing a story through words that inspired people and moved them to action. I bet if I gave you a few minutes, you could think of that early passion. It was before anybody made you do something. It was before you had an assignment at school, before you thought you knew what it would take to get into a certain profession. When you think about those fundamental passions and about words, peeling the onions back to see what's at the heart of things really matters. And so I want to do that about the word crisis. A crisis is not just a problem on steroids. It's not just a bad occurrence, like an accident. A crisis is fundamentally a collapse of what was, so it's going back is really not an option. Okay? It's really something where we're rebuilding and a rebirth is required. In Greek, the word krisos, the root of crisis, is actually choice. You have a choice. Think about in a medical crisis. When you hit a medical crisis, you're at the point where things are either going to go really downhill and demise, or they're going to turn around and you kind of have a therapeutic intervention to go to rebirth. So I want you to think about crisis not just as the shit show we've all lived through, but really about this moment that shook everything up. What we knew to be true collapsed. It was complex. It wasn't just a problem to fix. But now we have to choose about what's next. It can happen, we think about, going through the airport yesterday, 9/11, thinking about that shared crisis, the literal collapse of so much, not just two buildings. It was of trust and of our society and of so much, and a rebuilding that in many ways has brought incredible healing and beauty and depth. But it could also be a relationship crisis, a betrayal in a friendship. It could be an identity crisis, trying to figure out who you are at age 13 or at 30 or at 55. These crises are times where going back is not an option, so moving forward gives us some choices. What do we do next? The key thing I can share with you as you think about what's going on in your own life, and maybe things, this isn't an all or nothing. You've got some things that are going great, some things that you feel unsteady. But one thing we've learned in the last year is that if we approach a crisis like something we can win, like a chess game, that where there are rules and they're consistent and there's a win, lose, or draw, that is a recipe for madness, right? When I was writing the book, Netflix came out with The Queen's Gambit. I don't know if anybody watched that. It's about a series of chess tournaments in the 1960s. I loved it because it's based in Lexington, Kentucky, my hometown. Her first tournament was right there at Henry Clay High School. And again, I'm not a chess person at all, but there's a certain intrigue and drama when you think you know the rules and you've practiced and you concentrate and you're smart and the green light goes. We're kind of like that professionally too, right? Like, I know my stuff. I've prepped. This is not my first rodeo. I know the checklist for a great event. I know the checklist for great client relationships. I know the checklist for raising the value of my business. That really gets blown up during a crisis where we have to think more about navigating a roaring sea. Okay, so instead of winning a game, it's less about certainty, more about stability. Less about rules we used to rely on, and more about agility to this wild, rumbling wave that's going out there. So as we talk about the different types of crises and how that may show up in your life and your business, I want you to go back to thinking in your mind, that mental model of what am I really up against? Am I thinking about charging the hill? Am I thinking about winning the game? Instead, I want you to kind of shift that and think about how am I riding this tidal wave? It could knock me over at any moment. And maybe I could surf it. Maybe I could get solid. I can look outward. I can hold my body in a way that I'm agile and strong and centered. That's really, really good.